All right, everybody, welcome back to the All Me podcast. My name is Don Hooten. I'm the president of the Taylor Hooten Foundation. And today I'm going to be your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Jason Nagata, who is a celebrity that I've been super excited to talk to. Recently, he was in a film done by Men's Health titled Generation Flex, and there was so much great information in that film, Dr. Nagata. I just remember after watching just sort of the preview of it, if you will, and then having an opportunity to do a sort of the premiere here in Dallas, I immediately reached out to Duran. I was like, can you please try to connect the two of us? You're going to be a wealth of information on this podcast, but thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. So you're a very decorated doctor. I know you give a lot back to your community. You've won a ton of awards. So before we kind of get into that and your expertise, and I want to talk about eating disorders, let's kind of go back and talk about young Jason before you were a doctor, sort of growing up. What led you to want to get into the field of medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have to say I wasn't pre-med from a very early age, although definitely my parents influenced me. My mother was a neonatal, like newborn nurse, and my father was a mental health social worker. And so I do think that now that I'm sort of in this adolescent medicine space, it's basically like the merger of what my parents did, like pediatrics and mental health. And so that I think, a big influence was from my parents and just hearing about their work, growing up and, definitely being in like the health services industry where you're, trying to alleviate suffering and, make people's health better. But I will say that it was not like a straightforward path. I definitely considered other fields, and ultimately I was actually very interested in nutrition and nutritional health. And so, yeah, when I went to college, I actually was studying kind of global health. I actually did some malnutrition work in Guatemala, and then even some food insecurity and nutrition work in Kenya among like people with food insecurity. And so I've always been interested in like how nutrition kind of influences your health. And when I got to medical school, one of my advisors said, "Oh, well, one area that you might consider is actually eating disorders because that obviously is a big nutritional component, and that is like a really important part of people's health. But it also there's like some mental health components. It's mostly in teenagers and young adults, which is kind of an underserved population. And so I did." Early on in medical school, start to shadow in our adolescent eating disorder clinic. And I found that I really enjoyed working with that patient population. Teenagers are kind of growing to be their own adults, but I think there's still a lot of need in terms of mental health. And I will say that one of the very first patients that I took care of was actually a 16-year-old male wrestler. And he was actually referred to the eating disorders clinic by his parents because he had been kind of struggling for years, but I think some of his behaviors had sort of been masked by the fact that, all wrestlers have to some extent have to do like weigh-ins and have, engage in some sort of weight manipulation for that. But he had just taken it to the extreme where he was weighing himself like 10 times a day. He was cutting all of his carbs and fats and only eating proteins. And so it did get to a point where it really was consuming his life. And, he was exercising 5 or more hours every single day. And he felt very guilty if he wasn't doing that during his free time. And I remember that at the time I was trying to, as a student, read about how to best help men or boys with eating disorders. And there was very little guidance or medical literature about it. And that, I think, set my path for really trying to better understand, do research, provide clinical guidance for boys and men with eating disorders, which is sort of how my career launched.
Yeah, I believe there's still the sort of stigma that eating disorders and stuff is just an issue with, females, young girls. Even today, as we go out into schools and talk, I mean, you still think when you kind of talk about the things that we do when it comes to, everything from nutrition to dietary supplements to anabolic steroids and beyond, a lot of it stems obviously from, eating disorders or this sort of thing. But is that just a myth that, it's the majority of it's females, high school girls? Can you kind of talk to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I do think that from when eating disorders were first described or researched, it has traditionally been a very feminized illness. And even the current categories of eating disorders that we have tend to be more reflective of weight loss goals and thinness, which I think is more reflective of the feminine body ideal of being thin and lean. And so I do think that there is a bias in that most people think that eating disorders only affect girls and women, but in fact, they can affect boys and men. And I do think that there's just general under recognition in society and communities, and even within the medical profession about some of the body image considerations for boys and men. And so some of our work has been trying to really raise awareness of these issues, both for clinicians and for the general public.
Excellent. Hopefully we can do more of that in the podcast today. So I did see that you're a grad at the University of Pennsylvania. I went to high school in Pennsylvania, ended up, playing baseball, and I started college in the South, but ended up at a small private school there in Pennsylvania, not far from UPenn. So you're originally from Pennsylvania. How did you end up at UPenn? I'm just kind of wondering, like, we were probably in the same area roughly around the same time.
Yeah. So I grew up in Southern California, and that's where I went to elementary for high school. But I think for whatever reason, since I'd stayed in Southern California for my first 18 years, I thought it would be kind of good to get as far away as I could from home just for college. So I went to the Northeast.
Wow.
And, Philadelphia, has a lot of history. Penn was founded by Benjamin Franklin. And so I think it was a good opportunity for me to, try something different. Obviously, I got a really great education, and, there I sort of studied biology, psychology, and public health, which is really some of the formative classes that I think led me to this field. I mean, I definitely had some great professors and mentors that, that shaped my current research for sure.
Yeah, wow, that's talk about a big move. SoCal to Pennsylvania, where I mean, you get all sorts of weather, cold weather. I get it. Growing up, we moved around a lot, so spent some time in Florida. After we graduated high school, moved to Texas, where we've been, for the past 20 or so years. But that's definitely a big move, especially if you were trying to just get away from Southern. You can't go any further, I guess, unless you got out into the ocean somewhere. So really cool, though. So what I want to focus on is obviously your expertise and what you're passionate about, and that's eating disorders. So while this seems to be a topic that more and more people are talking about today, and I think this has a lot to do with our younger generation, they're more open to talking about mental health and some of these topics that have been very, let's call it taboo for a while, hush hush. More people are wanting to talk about it. So, I mean, is eating disorders a new issue? Has this been around for decades? Can you kind of talk more to sort of the history of eating disorders and where it's been brought about to today?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, I will say that eating disorders have been described in the medical literature for hundreds of years. I do think that our understanding of them has changed over time. And I do think that certainly the cultural context of eating disorders, and particularly like some of the societal pressures for body image, certainly have changed. And I think along with those changes come with, some changes in the way that eating disorders sort of present or manifest in individuals. But in general, eating disorders are serious health conditions that both affect our mental health and one's physical health, and are particularly related to food and eating behaviors. And there actually are a range of eating disorders. In general, they do involve some sort of change or restriction of food intake that can affect your health, but it can go either way, like either restricting food, trying to fast, skip meals, restrict your caloric intake, or in some cases there is like overeating or consuming too much food, like binge eating. And usually there's a body image component. So someone, feels dissatisfied with their body and they're trying to engage in these behaviors to change it. And so in some disorders, people sort of are afraid of becoming fat and they try to have thinness oriented goals. Whereas in some cases, people are trying to become muscular and change their body shape for that. But I think that one of the key components is that it involves some sort of change in your eating or food behaviors that can affect your physical health and also your own sort of self-image.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what would be, I guess, some of the, you don't want to say popular, right? Popular is not the word that I'm looking for, but sort of what are the most common types of eating disorders are you seeing out there? Because I mean, I know you'll have some one-offs here and there, but just in your general practice and what you're doing through research, what are the common ones?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so I will say that probably the eating disorder that gets the most attention or that people think about the most when they think about, a stereotype of someone with an eating disorder is anorexia nervosa. And so that's when there is an unhealthy low body weight. It involves a fear of gaining weight or a fear of becoming fat, and then some extreme behaviors to try to control one's weight or shape. So that could include severe limiting of calories or food intake, overexercising, or even using laxatives or diet pills to try to, or even vomiting to lose weight. So I think anorexia nervosa is probably the most studied and well-known eating disorder. But interestingly, actually the most common of the current eating disorder types is actually on the opposite spectrum. It's actually binge eating disorder actually is the most common one. And that involves eating large proportions of food in a short amount of time. And often an individual feels guilt with eating that much and a sense of a loss of control. So they can't control that they're overeating. And oftentimes they eat beyond feeling comfortably full. So they're eating even though they may feel full. And so actually binge eating disorder, which is more associated with like obesity and overweight and overeating, actually is more common than the restrictive eating types like anorexia nervosa. But I think oftentimes we mostly think about the restrictive eating disorder types. I will say that there is also bulimia nervosa, which can then involve some sort of what they call compensatory behavior. So like can have some binge eating components and or purging or vomiting components. And then finally, since I was mentioning conditions that kind of affect boys and men, I will mention that there's also a relatively new diagnosis called muscle dysmorphia, which is more commonly known as bigorexia or reverse anorexia. Now, technically, this is a type of body dysmorphic disorder, but I think there's a lot of overlap with eating disorders. And that's when somebody becomes obsessed or preoccupied with becoming muscular. They think of themselves as puny or skinny, even if they objectively are big and muscular, and they may use muscle building behaviors like anabolic steroids or compulsive exercise or other performance enhancing drugs or substances in order to become more muscular.
And I think that's where, you were really highlighted in the film Generation Flex that Men's Health did, kind of talking about, this specific type of topics, but also, referring to some of the young men that were in the film. So when it comes to these types of eating disorders, as parents, is this something that's passed down genetically? Is this something that can be derived from the way we talk to our young people? Right. So maybe unintentionally. I mean, you've heard if you've ever played sports, right? You got to get bigger, stronger, and faster. But there's stories of people that are, hey, you're too skinny. Maybe you need to eat this. Or, you have a teen that's a little bit overweight, right? That happens as the hormones are changing and what have you. And maybe you shouldn't eat that, right? Like you're getting a little chubby, or whatever the case might be. Sort of what does some of these eating disorders stem from? And, how as a society, what can we do to maybe prevent some of that from happening, especially with young kids?
Yeah, that is, I think, the $1 million question, like what causes eating disorders? And I will say that, our general understanding is that it's very complex and there are likely multiple components. So there likely is a genetic component. There likely is some societal influences, including parents, media, peers. And so I think it's a combination. And, depending on the specific eating disorder and the specific individual, it may be a different sort of breakdown. But in general, there is likely a genetic component. There have been some studies that show that there are certain genetic traits that can increase the risk of developing an eating disorder. And family studies have shown that like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, they do tend to run in families. So there is like a higher family risk. But at the same time, there are, societal components. And so the traditional thought is that the three like large pillars of societal influence are the media, which now I think, traditionally was like television, movies, magazines, but now I think definitely includes social media, and then parents. So even apart from the genetics, just as you were mentioning, like, perhaps pressures that parents have on their children, or way that they talk about their child's weight or appearance, or even the parents' own behaviors about their own appearance and weight control can influence their kids. And then, certainly as teenagers are growing older, the parents become maybe less important and their peers become very important. And so, trying to fit in with peers and, going through puberty and kind of body changes, I think that other sort of biological component, which is like growth spurt, rapid changes during puberty that lead to, appearance changes and, other changes that I think on the one hand make teenagers a little bit more sensitive about their own bodies because they're not quite comfortable in their own bodies and skins yet, and they're still developing. Plus, constant comparison with other peers who are also having changing bodies and appearances. So I do think that there's a lot of different components at play. We do, in general, know that the adolescent and young adult period is sort of the highest risk for eating disorders because of all these changes and pressures. So I do think that there are multiple components for sure.
Okay. Interesting, because one of the things you had brought up is social media. And I kind of wanted to pick your brain on that because, today when you take a picture, you can really alter your image from colors to your eyes to, changing, your skin and all these different filters that they have today. And it's interesting because when we're out doing programs, I mean, even as early as middle school, which, we do some middle school programming and it's, vastly different than what we would do in high school versus even, if we're talking to a group of professionals. But what you're hearing from the kids is about some of these influencers that they're seeing. So much so, Dr. Nagata, sometimes, I mean, I had it was an eighth grade kid, and then it also happened to a ninth grade kid all in the same week. But they were essentially asking us, like, at what age did they think was appropriate to start using TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, because they wanted to gain muscle. And I'm assuming it's what they're seeing on social media and some of these influencers that are openly talking about some of this type of drug use. But I kind of want you to talk to, if you've seen any trends change just even over the past 24, 36 months, just due to some of what kids are seeing online. Because again, it's like, unless you're really sick, likely don't need to be on TRT, but they weren't doing it because of the way they felt. They were doing it to change the way they look. So I'd love if you could kind of talk to that, or, what's the research showing on?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there's a lot to unpack there. But I think maybe taking a broad step back about media influences, I do think that, we've always known that the media plays a big part in the way that, gender norms and body ideals are portrayed. But in past generations, the form of media that most young people were exposed to would be like Hollywood movies, television shows, and magazines, perhaps even like Men's Health. Um, but for the most part, young people were living in a read-only environment. So like when I was growing up, I'd see movies and stuff, but most kids would never expect to be featured in a Hollywood movie or to be on the cover of Men's Health magazine. So you were consuming or seeing some of these images, but there wasn't the same kind of pressure to produce the images yourself for the most part. But now with social media, you're no longer in a read-only environment. In fact, in order to sort of interact with peers, you sort of have to have your own accounts. You have to portray, some body image on accounts. And studies have shown that, the types of images or videos that get the most interactions and likes and comments are ones that show off your body. And so there's now this pressure to produce content that was not around in past decades. And I think that pressure has really led to this perfect storm of constant comparisons to others' bodies. And, people also, to your point, I think that on social media, there's a lot of filtering that happens. Even if there's not filtering, people can have a photo shoot with hundreds or thousands of photos and choose the one that looks the best. So you're not really seeing an accurate portrayal of reality. So you're comparing yourself to the best of everyone else that's been filtered, edited, curated, selected. And then there's, this pressure to display your own body. And in some cases, unfortunately, there's just exposure to overt eating disorder content. Like, unfortunately, there are young people who have eating disorders who actually just post content related to their disordered eating, which can inadvertently get to other young people to see. And then I think, to your point, because there's so many producers of content, many who are just teenagers or young adults, there's also not quite the same level of, like, I guess there's the potential for a lot of misinformation. Like, people can just say whatever they want. Like, oh, I did this, I had this rapid body transformation. I didn't eat anything for 3 days. I took all this protein powder or whatever, and look at me. But, there's no, there's no quality control. And so people see, and also there's also, I think, more secretive advertising. Like, I think when you watch a commercial on TV, it's clear that that's a commercial, that's an advertisement. But I think on social media, many influencers get paid to promote products, but it's not clear that they're getting paid to do that. And so some people can be promoting certain regimens or products that makes it sound like they've been using it. This is how they got to that point. But in fact, they are just getting paid by the company, but they don't disclose that necessarily. So I do think that there's a lot more opportunity for misinformation or getting, false information on social media that's not quite as obvious as it was traditionally.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because one, going back to sort of the media when we were younger, right? You'd watch things like Terminator 2 and, Arnold Schwarzenegger was this massive guy. But if you put Arnold Schwarzenegger up to some of the bodybuilders today, he's not quite as large as they are. But you never really saw guys day to day, walking around that looked like Arnold, where I've never thought about that way today. I mean, you can get on social media and I mean, you scroll through and you just see these god and goddess like bodies just thrown at you on a day-to-day basis, where I mean it was for us, I mean it was just when you put a movie on, right? Like it wasn't constant on TV, or we didn't have that media bombarding us each day, and it was more of a read-only type environment. So that's really interesting that you brought that up, and hopefully that's starting to clarify, especially in some of the folks that are a little bit older that understand what we're talking about. Because the young people, they're like, magazine, what's that? You know what I mean? And I always tell people that was like the OG social media, right? Like back in the day, that's how we sort of got our content, and you would subscribe to what you were interested in. But one of the thoughts that I had here, again, from like a parent's perspective or an adult influence perspective, a coach's perspective, what are some of the warning signs that us as adults can spot maybe in a young person that, there might be something going on here? But most importantly, Dr. Nagata, how would you deal with that? Because again, we want to have compassion. We don't want to say, oh, you have such and such eating disorder. You need to go get yourself help, right? That could make things worse. That's not the way to do it, I'm sure. But can you kind of talk to those two things? Is what can we look for? How do we get somebody help?
Yeah. I think that one thing that I'll mention is that I do think that body dissatisfaction to eating disorders, there is sort of a spectrum. And the first thing that I'll acknowledge is that there are really intense body pressures for young people especially, but for everyone really in society. And while, there are many people who are dissatisfied with the way they look and they may be engaging in some eating behaviors to change that, whether it's dieting or, eating more protein or whatever it may be, that doesn't mean that all those people have a full-blown clinical eating disorder. It's only a subsection of those who kind of take things to the extreme. And so I do think that there's sort of like a spectrum where, unfortunately, 2/3 of teenagers today say that they're trying to either gain weight or lose weight or do something, change their weight and change the way they appear. But, not 2/3 of American teens have eating disorders. From that, to me, the warning signs, the red flags are when people are engaging in behaviors or thoughts that really like worsen their quality of life, that lead to preoccupations or obsessions about food or appearance or weight or exercise in a way that's really worsening their quality of life. And when it's starting to affect their socializing, like maybe they won't hang out with friends anymore, or they're not doing the other activities they enjoy because like they're now just obsessed with, whether it's exercising or eating healthy, and it starts to really impact their socializing or their schoolwork, or if they're in the workforce, like their regular work. I think those are sort of generally when it sort of borders into this disordered territory, and people might consider getting help. Because I will say that, in general, in moderation, doing physical activity, eating healthy, those are all generally good things in moderation. It's just that when they're taken to the extreme, when they really start leading to obsessions that really impair other ways of functioning, that's to me when it goes into the eating disorder territory.
Yeah, I remember, you know, I guess I wouldn't call it an eating disorder, but one of the things that my parents saw with my brother, sort of different than my sister and I, because we were always athletic and playing sports and doing that sort of thing. But Taylor was going to the gym in the morning before school, would have practice and then go to the gym again. So, I mean, you're talking twice a day lifting. He had put on about 30 pounds within about 6 weeks, which obviously muscle. And it's, like we tell parents in programs, right? Like that's impossible to do at 16 years old. It doesn't matter what they're eating. So he all of a sudden just became sort of obsessed with, having to get bigger. The food he was taking, obviously he was using drugs. But let's go sort of back to, the eating disorders that we're talking about in general with young people. So maybe you've identified something where somebody, or let's say the young person has come to you as a parent, coach, hey, my quality of life has gone down because I'm so focused on, losing weight. And the way I'm thinking about food is becoming very negative. So I feel guilty if maybe I eat more than 400 or 500 calories or so in a sitting. What would a parent do? Obviously you can't see the world's patients, but where can they go online to get some reputable resources or help? Do they talk with their primary care physician first, or sort of what steps could a parent do to sort of have that interaction with their loved one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of just general online resources or information, there is a National Eating Disorder Association,
Okay.
and the National Eating Disorder Association has a website that has general information about all the different types of disorders. I think there's also like a screening activity that you can do that you can kind of fill out things and it can give you a sense of, an initial sense of if your loved one has an eating disorder or what might be good next steps. They do also have or they work with other organizations where there is like a hotline or a telephone, or I think there's also a chat that you can call and talk with someone. But I do think that at the point that you're concerned that there might be an issue, I do think that another good way to get more individualized care is to have either your primary care doctor or if it's for your child, the pediatrician, bring up some of those concerns with them because as I mentioned, eating disorders, often have a physical health component as well as a mental health component.
Okay.
And so at the very least, your primary care doctor can, check any kind of weight changes and check any labs or other like physical consequences that could have happened. And they also can be a good point person to try to get referrals to perhaps a mental health provider or a dietitian to help with some of those other aspects as well.
And what I'll be able to do is I'm sort of taking notes here so that I can take some of these resources and I'll put them down in the show notes. So as people are either watching this on YouTube or maybe they're listening to the audio only version, they can pick up their device and scroll down and get some of that information. But do you see, just the difference in males and females? Is there, one gender that's more prone to a specific eating disorder versus another? And I was just kind of curious as to, especially as a parent, we have a daughter and a son. I mean, is there one, like, I could see both boy, the boy and the girl wanting to lose weight, right? That's always a thing, but also you could see them, hey, maybe I want to gain some weight. So from your, research and, knowledge, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, at a very high level, the sort of idealized feminine body ideal is thin and skinny. And so a vast majority of girls or women with eating disorders have more like kind of restrictive eating disorder. They're trying to lose weight. As I mentioned, I think 2/3, unfortunately, of high schooler girls currently in the US are actively trying to lose weight. So I think with girls, it's much more common that they're trying to lose weight and that could lead to higher risk of like anorexia nervosa or some of the restrictive eating disorders. For boys and men, I do think that it's a little bit more complex. In general, the idealized sort of masculine image is bulky and muscular. And so there's a large proportion of boys and men who are trying to gain weight, particularly to gain muscle. They may still be trying to like lose fat or be lean and muscular. But in these national studies, we do find that actually 2/3 of teenage boys are also trying to change their weight, but about half of those who are trying to change their weight are trying to gain weight, and half of them are trying to lose weight. So some of them may be considered overweight or obese, and then they actually are trying to lose weight from that. So I do think that for boys, it's a little bit more complicated. Like there's an equal number of boys who are trying to lose weight and who are trying to gain weight. For girls, unfortunately, it's pretty much a majority are trying to lose weight.
Interesting. Okay. And so are there any myths out there? This is always a neat topic just because there are any myths about, eating disorders, just things that you could debunk that they might be hearing over and over on social media, or, parents might be hearing, they being kids, right? If you're out on social media, or even parents, right? I mean, we're all targeted by these different ads. But are there some myths out there around this topic that you could sort of debunk, some of the ones that you hear often?
Yeah. I do think that most people have in their mind a stereotype of the way somebody with an eating disorder looks like. And oftentimes it's like a teenage girl who's skinny, perhaps wealthy, perhaps more white or Caucasian. And I do think that the first myth to sort of debunk is that eating disorders only affect girls and skinny girls, because we do know that eating disorders affect people of all genders, of all races, of all socioeconomic backgrounds. So I do think that while there are certain stereotypes that people have, we do know that eating disorders can affect basically everyone. And then specifically, the other thing that I had mentioned earlier is that I also think that the most prominent eating disorder is anorexia nervosa. So people think that everyone with an eating disorder has to be skinny. As I mentioned, actually, the most common eating disorder is binge eating disorder. And actually, for people who would be considered like overweight or obese by sort of medical classification systems, actually, those individuals are actually at a higher risk of engaging in disordered eating behaviors and actually developing an eating disorder. And it could be like an overeating disorder, like binge eating, than those who are skinny. So I do think that it's also important for people to note that you can't just tell based on the way somebody looks whether or not they have an eating disorder.
Yeah. Nope. The old saying goes, never judge a book by its cover, right? So let's just talk about what treatment support looks like. So we've identified there's an issue, whether you've brought it up with your primary care physician. What does that look like going forward? Because if I go see a doctor, I mean, am I seeing, a psychiatrist, a counselor? Am I just seeing my primary care physician? Is this something for me? Like, let's say I've got an eating disorder. Is it curable? So can you kind of talk about what the treatment and support system looks like?
Yes. I think in an ideal scenario, if somebody is identified as having an eating disorder, they would sort of have an interdisciplinary treatment team that would involve a medical provider, a mental health provider, and a dietitian or a nutritionist. As we mentioned, eating disorders are very complicated because they have mental health components, a physical health component, and
Yep.
there's obviously a lot of eating behaviors. So in the best world, people would have at least those three providers, like a medical doctor, mental health provider, which could be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, social worker, any kind of therapist or counselor, and then somebody who can advise on the nutrition, just so that you have an expert and specialist in each of those areas that can support both your physical health and your mental health and make sure that we're not running into any of the sort of red zones or dangerous areas. And I do think it's so important to emphasize that people really do get professional help because unfortunately, when taken to the extreme, eating disorders can be life-threatening. And unfortunately, over 10% of people with eating disorders will die from them. So it's not something to be taken lightly. So that's why it is really important that people get specialized care. Now, while there unfortunately are a lot of people that don't do well, I do think that in terms of treatment, if you are able to get into therapy and medical and nutritional support, many people are able to, I don't know if I'd say like fully be cured of an eating disorder, but can definitely like change their behaviors and habits such that they're able to function normally, they can kind of get back on track. And we do have certainly many patients who have been able to live out the rest of their lives, with, get back to school work, regular work, social aid. And many people describe that they may still have, it's never like completely gone, but they can get it to a point where they're able to get back to doing the things that they love and, sort of not have it be always taking over their lives.
Yeah, I have a few friends that I've talked to that have struggled with this. Some are older, some are younger. And they say, well, it never like really goes away, but they're always kind of thinking about it. But I guess because they're healthy now, or healthier, should we say, they understand sort of the ramifications. Like if I go back to that lifestyle, if I go back to that behavior I was doing before, I know what the consequences are. So, but at some point they're still thinking in their brain, like, oh, I've got to change the way I look and I feel. But when it comes to just sort of society as a whole, right? So let's say, you're the all powerful and you could find a way to make this go away. And I know a lot of this is society driven, the way we talk to each other and all that sort of stuff. But what could you do from the aspect as a parent, as maybe leadership in school, if you could just sit and wave your hands over and say, these are some of the things, if we change them, that could really help reduce the number of people that are struggling sort of with these eating disorders?
Yeah. I think that in general, we kind of are a society that like lives at extremes and really prioritizes or values like the best. And I think that somehow that pressure really can manifest in children that leads to sort of these extreme behaviors. Because oftentimes it's like not enough that somebody just looks good. They want to like be the skinniest or lose the most weight. And it's sort of like we live in these extremes. Like in order to win or do this, we have to do everything like 110%. And that also involves food or exercise. And so I do think that in general, if there could be just maybe a little bit less pressure on kids or adults about appearance and the focus particularly on appearance, but maybe just generally encouraging certainly I don't want anybody to come out of this podcast and think, oh, like I shouldn't think about eating healthily or I shouldn't think about exercising, because I do think that, in moderation, those are all still things that can generally improve your health and well-being. But I think it's just when they're taken to the extreme. So I think if we could sort of just generally encourage or role model, healthy physical activity that still brings joy to your life, that like releases endorphins, but is not, like every waking hour at the gym. And similarly, like, it's good to like eat your fruits and vegetables and have a balanced diet, but not necessarily try to restrict to less than 500 calories a day and, skip this meal or do fasting regimens. So I think somehow if we had a little bit more room for like moderation rather than excess or extremes, I think that would help. And also just, I think also like in coaching and schools, like there's a lot of pressure to be the best and to win and to do all these things. And I think that while it's not, I think somehow that pressure and this sort of these extremes, I think are what often like lead children like kind of over the edge.
Out of curiosity, is this something that's worse in the US versus other countries around the world? Do you know any of that data? Because I'm curious if it's just here in the US. I mean, I know in other countries, parents push their kids, right? Because we all want, our kids to have a better life than we did, right? But do you know what the data shows on that? Like, is it eating disorders more common here in the US than other countries, say around the world?
That is a great question. And I do think that, you were talking about the history of eating disorders. And I will say that, decades ago, eating disorders were actually thought to be like a culture, what they called a culture bound syndrome. So only certain societies like the US or sort of more, I don't know, Western, like industrialized societies that had this media were thought to have eating disorders. But eating disorders are no longer considered a culture bound syndrome. And I do think that because of globalization and particularly because of the media and social media, social media for the most part, has no boundaries. Like people who are posting in the US, those influencers can be viewed anywhere else in the world. I mean, there are some exceptions with certain platforms, but in general, social media right now is a universal phenomenon. And so I do think that with social media and globalization, unfortunately, I think that these pressures are actually permeated to almost all societies these days. And so these same pressures, even if they're often being generated from the US or Europe, they are definitely seen and viewed and manifested all over the world. So I do think, and we have lots of international collaborations in countries in every continent. And I do think that this is somewhat a universal phenomenon now, that there are these body image pressures, particularly for youth who are engaging in some of these behaviors. So I think it's no longer a culture bound syndrome. Certainly, the context matters and there are differences country to country and region to region. But I do think in general, we are seeing more of eating disorder like issues across the country, across the globe.
Okay. So sort of the last thing I would ask you to do is, as an expert in your field, somebody that understands this, that you've seen hundreds, if not thousands of patients, and you were talking directly to the parents out there. I mean, what would you want them to know? I mean, what might help them on a day-to-day basis, sort of maybe manage this with their, whether it's their kids friends, or maybe they might be a coach, right? Or they're in a school, they're a teacher, they're around some of these young people. If you had some advice that you could give them, what do you think would help them the most?
Yeah, I think first, it's really important to sort of be a role model and to practice what you preach. And so I do think that, when it comes to, for instance, social media, we know that actually one of the biggest predictors of kids or teen social media use actually is their parents' use and how much they're on their phones and stuff. So if you're setting rules for your kids that you want them to follow, I think it's important that you role model them yourselves, which is obviously easier said than done. But I do think that it's shown that parent behaviors really influence their kids' behaviors, even if you don't think they do. And then I do think in general, just providing an open sort of, this is maybe obvious, open, like supportive, loving environment such that if your kid is facing any issue related to self-esteem or body image, or something bad happened at school that's perhaps making them feel bad about their bodies, and then they're now starting to try to lose weight or whatever, creating a sort of line of communication, whether it's like around family meals or just, check in during the days, that you are able to like keep tabs on how your kid is feeling, especially if there are any kind of mental health concerns, that they feel, somewhat willing to chat with you. Again, easier said than done, but at least if you have like sort of an open if you're like checking in with them regularly, it's more likely that some of that stuff will be revealed than not. And then also, I think just being a little bit cautious about some of the comments that we make, because I will say that we've had some kids who have developed eating disorders, and when they're reflecting on what led to it, there are sometimes like very well-intentioned parents or adults or even pediatricians who kind of make comments about someone's appearance, particularly if they're like would be considered overweight or obese, about like weight loss, that then gets internalized and kind of goes awry or goes to the extreme. And so I do think that I would be somewhat careful about just the way that you're commenting on your child's appearance, because they sometimes can internalize them much more than we think.
No, that's great advice. And you're very well spoken on this, and you explained it in a way that, especially for us, lay folks can understand. So I appreciate that. But, you've covered everything I really wanted you to cover. But before I let you go, because I know we're kind of getting at time here, as part of the All Me podcast, we do what's called our curveball round. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. What I'll do is I'll read the first question. Whatever comes to your mind first, go ahead and answer it. This has nothing to do with what you do day to day. It's always a fun type of thing just to kind of end our podcast. So you let me know when you're ready, and I'll give you the first question.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. So if you could switch jobs with anyone for a week, what role would you choose?
I would be a marine biologist. I really like sea animals.
Me too. I always tell my wife, my kids, my spirit animal's a manatee. We grew
Mine
up
is
in
an
Florida.
orca.
It's like the sea cow, right?
Yeah, I like the killer whales.
Okay. Yeah. Those are cool. I'd always like to see those in person. So, second question. What's something you've always wanted to do, but you haven't done yet?
I do really like to travel. And recently, I've actually been lucky to have the opportunity to actually travel for conferences and for sort of professional meetings to talk about eating disorders around the globe. And the next on my list is actually to go to Patagonia, in South America. And so actually I have some collaborators there who are actually doing eating disorder research in Chile and Argentina. And I'm hoping to be able to go there next year and also maybe pack in some hiking after those visits.
Okay, well, cool. Last question here for you. This is a good one. I smiled when I read this one. So if you had to talk like a cartoon character for the rest of your life, who would you choose?
I don't know if this counts as I don't know if Pixar counts as cartoon characters, but I think that on the marine theme, I really like Dory in Finding Nemo, like when she's talking about the whale thing and she kind of has these long, like, what are you doing? I think that would be funny.
Okay, well, cool. No, as soon as I read that, I was literally laughing to where like my eyes were tearing. I was like, I've never asked anybody this question before. We try to always have a different sort of question sort of to end our podcast. So I appreciate you playing along, but Dr. Nagata, again, thank you so much. Again, I've been really looking forward to this just after seeing, what you had to say in Men's Health Generation Flex was very inspiring. It touched me. And just from the moment I saw it, like I told you, I reached out immediately to Dorena and I was like, can you please connect us? I'm sure he's busy, but we'd love to be able to record him for the podcast. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule to do this for us.
Oh yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to fight the fight to try to raise awareness. And thanks also to you and everything and the foundation for all the work that you do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to work together, right? Teamwork makes the dream work.
Yes.